and welcome to this AIHI seminar. My name is Enrico Coyera, for those of you who don't know me. Today we are very fortunate to have a good friend of the Institute, a global icon, I think we'd say. Wouldn't you say that? No. You wouldn't? Apparently not. You would. So Professor Cliff Hughes is Professor of Patient Safety and Clinical Quality here at Macquarie. We're very lucky to have you here and we appreciate that. Cliff has a big international footprint in the world of safety and quality and what he's done. He's the immediate past president of the International Society for Quality in Healthcare, ISQA, which is a big job. And many of us first got to know him when you were the CEO of the Clinical Excellence Commission here at New South Wales, which sounds like a career, doesn't it? Except before that, there was 25 years of being a cardiothoracic surgeon with an AO thrown in. So I'm intimidated, I don't know about you. We're going to be hearing today about meaningful mentors and trained drivers. I'm hoping we'll have to hear about meaningful dementors, because I've had a few of those. Cliff, welcome and thank you very much for today's talk.
Thanks. How do we bridge the gap between what we do as researchers, what do we do about bridging the gap between what we do as teachers and the people who have to put all that stuff into action by the bedside? And I thought, that's like taking coals to Newcastle. But there's a better way to take coals to Newcastle, and that's by train. So I thought I'd just throw in a few of my experiences from something far removed from Macquarie and go into some of the areas that I have a real passion about, which is driving steam trains. I have called this, if I get the right button here, meaningful mentors. And what I want you to do is do the thinking during the day about how you can interact with somebody that might be your mentor or you might be their mentor. That's the best way to bridge the gap. Straight away, we are closing the gap. And there's a lot of places where you can go to read about this sort of stuff. You can read about the Disney Corporation, from a member of the Disney Corporation who became a CEO of a number of hospitals, Alfred Lee. You can go and read about sporting teams from all sorts of sports psychologists, including this book called Stronger Together. Or you can go to the airport book and store and buy Malcolm Gladwell's books, all of which are relevant to what we're talking about. You can actually go and buy a cheap and nasty if you like, but there's a lot of depth in the Blanchard books, including 1 Minute Mentoring. You probably all have heard about 1 Minute Management. What about 1 Minute Mentoring? We'll come back to that. And other books that talk about some of the things that make mentoring an enjoyable, but more importantly, a very active task that we need to be involved in. Well, I want to start off by asking you a question, and we've actually configured the room a little bit differently. There are groups of 5 chairs, sort of almost like a circle. And I want you to think about a few things, and I want you to have a brief conversation in a moment. And I want you to think about reading tea leaves, or is it coffee beans these days? And I want you to think about this picture, and in those little clumps of 5, I just want you to, very quickly, just in a few minutes, tell me what you think is happening in this particular scenario. Quick buzz, and then a few people can feedback. Just have a think. So what are some of the key thoughts in your group about that very simple little cup?
2 cups.
2 cups.
That's the first thought. There's 2 cups.
What's happening?
Somebody's waiting for somebody else to turn up.
Yep, okay. Someone's waiting. What else?
We thought it was a meeting. So
A meeting, yes. Why did you think that?
The other person appears maybe to be listening because they just sort of
Right.
still, maybe.
Yep.
The person holding the cup, because the handle's pointed towards the other person, could be offering their help. You take
Could be.
my help, here's the handle.
Yep. Other thoughts?
I would usually wrap my hands around a coffee cup if I was cold, or maybe like seeking comfort or something.
Ah, that's a good thought. Yep, I think I heard comment over here. Yep, anything else?
Yeah, we thought it was a potentially anxious or personal conversation.
Yeah. Ever felt like that? You know, it's like you walk in and there's a cup and you put your hands around it for as much your own protection as the coffee. And I think sometimes we forget to read the tea leaves of the people that we work with, and they're really struggling. So here's somebody who wants some advice or wants comfort or wants strength or wants something, and they're hanging on to the cup. What I want you to do throughout this presentation is to read the pictures and think about what you can see somebody else needs in your workplace. Whether it's an AIHI, whether it's in the wards or the operating room, or wherever it happens to be, because that's the way we can actually change the environment in which we work, and we'll see how important that can be. Because mentors is actually a very exciting concept. It's not the traditional lecturer. AIHI is blessed with some extraordinary lecturers, not the usual old boring people that we used to go and sit by with chalk on a squeaky blackboard. But mentors can excite because they actually confront the issues. They don't confront people, they confront the issue, and they actually make us confront the issue. And they can help us see what the issue really is all about. They also encourage us to do something different, to innovate, not just to replicate our heroes. And in healthcare, it's quite a problem for us. We have young people who see a hero and they emulate their behaviour, whether it's a nursing unit manager or a surgeon or a physician or a radiologist or whatever, good and bad. What we want them to do is to start to innovate by changing for the good. And mentors can do that much more so than the apprenticeship model alone leads us to think about. But mentors do require a commitment, and we'll talk about that as you'll see through some of these experiences shortly. But with that commitment comes empowerment. And you might think we're talking about empowerment from the top to the bottom. No. We're talking about empowerment between the two people who are involved in the relationship. So that might be a researcher with a junior clinician. It may be a manager with a senior clinician. It may be a manager with a researcher. There are a whole series of permutation and combinations. But out of the conversations and out of the relationship comes a powerful bond between the two, but a much more powerful individual on both sides of the cup of coffee. And once you get to that stage, suddenly everything seems to make sense and your life can be full of joy or simply fulfilment. But mentees go through exactly the same process, the same words there. And why are we trying to take our mentees through that program? Well, the buzzword these days is professionalism. And we could go into the operating room and we could talk about it at some length. But I just want you to take you to this conversation, which was taken quite a few years ago in a preserved steam railway in Sussex in the UK. What's going on here, do you think?
Morning or afternoon tea?
Morning or afternoon tea. It's morning tea as it so happens, yep.
You look like a bunch of enthusiasts.
Yep.
Not unlike yourself.
Yep, actually they are a bunch of enthusiasts. I took the photo, that's why I'm not in the photo. Okay, this is morning tea. It's part of the everyday workabout job of a railwayman. And they love to sit round and they have tea. Now, they usually have tea in enamel jugs. Sorry, go back. In enamel jugs. It's usually strong enough to melt the spoon. And they love to talk. And they tell stories about chasing rabbits on the railways or narrowly missing a cow or whatever else. I was taught to drive steam trains by this guy here. His name is Clive Groom. He was a train driver all of his life. He left school, started driving trains for British Rail and was well known as a very, very good train driver, drove express trains between London and Glasgow. Time came for him to retire in his mid-50s. He had to retire. He didn't know what to do. So his wife said to him, well, what else do you like to do? He said, well, I'd quite like to try my hand at teaching. So he went to college and became a teacher. And he taught for a while. And he said, you know, I'm still not getting fulfilment. She said to him again, what would you like to do? He said, I'd like to go back driving trains. He said, well, why don't you teach driving trains? And he started the first footplate course. The footplate's where the drivers stand on a steam train. And he started the first one in the UK. And now it's big business where people like me can go and learn to drive. But interestingly enough, this person here is his daughter. She is also a qualified steam train driver. You might see her again later on. This person here, who is actually acting as a guard on the train, happens to be my wife. She wasn't actually being taught, but she was learning on the job. Reading the situation into these sorts of circumstances, we suddenly realise the power of what we'll talk about later on called the great good place, where people learn. And we learn interactions in the strangest of places, including at the back shed on rickety old chairs, not far away from a locomotive belching fire and smoke. And it struck me that what I learned on the railways was actually the ultimate in multidisciplinary teams. Here is what I used to do as a surgeon. We used to have up to 11 people in the operating room at any one point in time. They all had a role to play. It was very important that they played it. But the same thing's true on the footplate of a steam train. This is Liz, Clive's daughter. There's Clive over there. This guy here, who you can only just see, happens to be the senior check pilot for British Airways. Anyone who flew a plane had to go through John Quinn, beg your pardon, his inspection process. Here he is playing trains. Okay. This guy here used to run a drag line in an open-cut coal mine in the Midlands. Coal mines, open-cut coal mines are very dangerous places because they use chains everywhere and they can whip around and cause all sorts of problems. So on the footplate here, we actually have a little cosmos of high-risk industries. Professor Braithwaite has written about high-risk industries with myself and Joe Travaglia. But they're all here on the one locomotive. We've got a steam train driver, a coal operator, an airline operator, a steam train enthusiast, me, and also a surgeon, me. Okay, it was great fun, but I learned so much from this, a lot more about life than I learnt as all these other things that people like to say are intimidating, which they're not really, Enrico. I don't think so. But let's actually have a look at trains and see what we can learn very quickly. The first ever passenger carrying steam train ran on the 15th of September in 1830. On that day, Stephensons Rocket was one of the trains, was not only the first passenger train, it was also the first railway accident. Okay. As a result of the accident, they had to carry a passenger who'd been injured down the line 9 miles to a vicarage. There was no hospital nearby and they tried to salvage this person, but unfortunately he died. What had happened was that the train had stopped. It was a double track and everyone got off to have a little look around. No one had talked to them about the safety on the railways of those days. It was the first time a steam train ever run. But there was another train on the same railway on the other line. And it came round the bend and everyone panicked. And this guy ran across the track. Now, most of you probably don't run down railway tracks, but it's actually a very hard thing to do. The spacing is just not quite right on those sleepers. And he slipped and fell. The train ran over and he got a compound comminuted fracture of his femur, internal bleeding, and died. The tragedy of it all was, oh, by the way, that's George Stephenson there, who invented the steam loco. This is actually the memorial to a guy called W.R. Huskisson, who was a politician. He was touted to be an up-and-coming Prime Minister of the UK. Things go wrong suddenly, and we need to recognise that we can learn in these environments, but we have to learn equally as suddenly. So what I want to challenge you, the first thing today about mentors is we've got to act now, because the next problem in the life of our young person might be this afternoon. So it's no good sitting back and saying, oh, I saw that once. Evidence then becomes key. Now, I don't have to talk to this audience about the importance of evidence. You all know it. This is what Ernest Codman said over a century ago. Of course, unfortunately, he was wrong, at least in this line here, because it's still considered eccentric. You don't talk about your problems. Well, let's have a think about that. Here are some famous sayings. Any fool can learn from his or her own mistake. A wise person learns from the mistakes of others. Otto von Bismarck was the Minister and President of Prussia. He was also the first person to reunify Germany. Did you know Germany's been reunified twice? Now, he did it the first time. And this was his statement: the wise person learns from the mistakes of others. But I think the most important comment here is from a railwayman. His name's Bob Hughes. He's my father. He's passed away. He was a railwayman, that's why I got interested in trains. And he used to tell us four boys that a true statesman will tell people of their mistakes so that they're not repeated. Dad, who couldn't complete his university education or any education because of the Depression, made a significant number of suggestions to New South Wales Railway, including some variations to the dead man's handle, which proved to be a lifesaver, because he'd seen things go wrong and he acted upon the evidence, rather than say, oh, that happened to me once. But that happens so often in healthcare, or even in our research. Oh, yeah, we studied that once upon a time, but we didn't tell anybody about it. We haven't learned from it. So the mentor-mentee relationship is about saying, that happened to me once, but you can learn from my experience and start to share it. So, just in your groups now, 3 questions here. The first one, you probably just have a guess. How long did it take for rail to tell others of its mistakes? Secondly, this could be a long discussion, but try and keep it short. How long will it take for health to tell others of our own mistakes? And how could a mentor help manage an adverse event? Okay, a couple of minutes on those 3 questions. All right, that'll do. We'll come up with a few answers out of the groups. Up the back of the room here, how long do you think it took rail to start telling people about its own mistakes? Sorry? Pretty quick? Because they were dealing with the public, yep. Anyone got any other answers on pretty quick? Sorry?
I think people are people, and I think it might have taken them a while.
A while? What do you think a while means?
Years.
Years? Okay. 50 years? There's a progressive, okay. All right. Well, we can actually have a look. When did the first train run? 1830, 15th of September. 1842, 12 years for a parliamentary report on what went wrong on trains across the country, even though they've been run by lots of small private companies. Only 12 years. How long is it going to take health?
A bit longer.
Maybe 12 centuries, yeah. Who knows? But we've got to learn. But just have a look at this, because it's very interesting. There were 3 classes of accidents or events that they talked about. So class 1, beyond the control of passengers, 24 people killed. Class 2, where they contributed to their own demise, 17, roughly the same number across the country. Class 3, servants of the company, and this is the bit I really want to emphasise. That means staff, okay? This asterisk is actually in the parliamentary report. It wasn't read in that report. There were 20 staff killed. However, the asterisk goes to the footnote. No, this return is incomplete. There's no requirement to report accidents which are not of a public nature. Sorry, guys, you don't count. But you know, for every adverse event in healthcare, there's at least one secondary victim. And we don't pay any attention to them unless we develop a concept of mentoring people. Okay, starting to get a bit of a thread here. There's something that you and I can do in part of our normal work is to take other people, share our adverse events quickly so that they're not repeated. There's some terrible stories. One event which we haven't got time to talk about, 88 people, mostly children, were killed when 3 separate breaches in protocol occurred on the one Saturday. The kids were on their way to a big Sunday school picnic and 88 people died. But railways are complex like everything else, and in Australia we have 3 different railway gauges. The gauge is the distance between the tracks here, and you can see these are the 3 major tracks, major gauges. There are actually about another 50 different gauges around the world that people use. But in a country the size of Australia, why have we got 3 different railway gauges? Don't you think that's pretty stupid? I think it's really stupid. But I worked at 2 hospitals that were 20 minutes by car away from each other, Prince Alfred and Concord. We had neurologists in both, we had cardiologists in both, we had cardiac surgeons in both. We had haematologists in both. Guess how many protocols for the administration of warfarin we had?
More than two.
More than 2? Anyone want to have a guess? 9. Very close. For the same diseases, for the same basic people, 20 minutes apart, there was no standardisation. This was a huge impost on railways for many, many years. And we don't have time to show you what happened when you got to Albury, Wodonga or Wagga and you had to get off the train while they brought a train of a different gauge into the platform and you can continue your journey. The goods trains, they used to just run in, put a big gantry, lift the train up, move the train off its bogies, drop it on the next bogie and away to go. And they could change the train fairly quickly, but at a huge expense. So standardisation, or understanding the standard procedures, is something that we as people who've been in the system can do for new people coming in. And we can show them the gauge that they have to run on. Because the tracks are really important. I'm not sure if you've ever thought about railway lines. You probably all know that there's a little flange on the side of the wheel and people think that that's a safety measure and that's what keeps the train on the track, right? You know what I mean by the flange? All got that? A few nods? Yep, okay. Well, if that's the case, why isn't this roller mark from when the railway was produced, why isn't it worn smooth where the flange contacts the rail? Actually, if you have a really close look at any rail, go and stand down at the station, you can see this at Central, you can see it at Macquarie if the trains are running, and you can see that the point of contact is on the top of the rail. And it's only about as wide as your thumb. And you only need very small points of contact between the guidance and the train for it to work. The same thing is true in healthcare. If we give people guidance at the right time in the right place, we can actually make their journey through healthcare, both as a patient, but also as a member of staff, safe and secure. And this just goes to show how that works. In fact, you can actually take the flange off a train and the train would still follow the track if it was going at the right speed. And it's a fail-safe purpose, the flange, not the way it works. Very quickly, if you have a look here, this train, here's a train going straight ahead, the track's in the middle of the wheel. As the train goes round to the rail goes round to the right, you can see that the wheel is moving here. This is now a bigger diameter wheel, just here, compared to this one here, which is now a smaller diameter wheel. The wheels are not square, they're actually tapered. So if this is bigger, it means it's going faster, which means that it pushes the train around the corner. That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Well, I think it's fascinating. The fans is a fail-safe if you're going too fast or too slow, basically.
Around the corner, I imagine it might come into play.
It does touch it, yes. But again, if you have a look at the rails, you'll see it's remarkably uncommon. Going very slow through Wollstonecraft or one of those stations, you hear the squeal when the flange is rubbing on the wheels. We'll come back to that right at the very end. So the point here is that if we want to change behaviours, we need to keep things simple and find the point of contact between ourselves and our fellow colleagues. Okay. Now, all of you are doing research into health systems. Are you finding a point of contact with the people who are using the systems that you're researching? Now, we don't want to have too big a contact, otherwise we'll have all researchers and no clinicians, or all clinicians and no researchers. But we need to have contact nevertheless, and we should make sure that those contacts follow the natural laws, in this case, of human interaction, in this case, physical. We should standardise where possible to save the break of gauge and all those sorts of things. And we do have fail-safes when things go wrong, the flanges. Here's a good example of 2 contact points. This is the patient blood management and staff blood management guidelines for New South Wales Health. Okay? There are really only 2 points you need to know about here. If the hemoglobin is below 7, why don't you transfuse after elective surgery in someone who's not bleeding? If you've got a hemoglobin greater than 10, why on earth are you transfusing? We had all these algorithms we tried to get people to teach. We put this bow tie diagram. It was James Isbister from North Shore who devised this. You can see why it's called a bow tie. 2 simple things. Do you know how much blood usage that reduced in New South Wales? 30% of unnecessary blood was not given anymore. 12,000 units of blood. That's important economically and technically and for a lot of other reasons, but that means that's 12,000 times a patient was exposed to an unnecessary complication. By keeping it simple. I'm not going to show you here, but you can, if you had time, I'd show you how that simple guideline has moved the balance of transfusion away from people who do not need it. And what we need to do is to make sure that our programs work in the long term, and that program is still working today across our hospitals. It's now virtually automatic because we actually ask our residents to indicate why they were transfusing the patient. What was the haemoglobin? Below 7, why are you doing it? Above 10, why don't you? Why are you doing it? Below 7, why aren't you doing it? It followed natural rules, and again we had standard practices. These are the things that happen on the railways since 1830 and have become entrenched. The railways got a very strict code of behaviours. But things do go wrong. So I'm going to take you through a few examples in the next few minutes. Granville was the worst rail disaster in the country's history. Okay. January 1977. These photos were taken actually by an orthopaedic surgeon, Ron Huckstep. I'm not going to go into too much detail about these accidents because they were tragedies. But just to point out what happened, 83 people died, 900 rescuers were involved, 5,000 sightseers. Okay, we love to get involved and point the finger, okay? And sometimes our M&Ms can come a little bit like that, but that produces a cynicism of itself. And this is bad mentoring here, okay? This is where somebody says, I don't mean to sound cynical. I don't think it did much more than change some specific state safety standards involving bridges and trains. You might say, what's got to do with the bridge? Well, in fact, the cause of this problem was actually the construction of the bridge, or rather the repair to the bridge. The bridge at Auburn had a very rough surface, so the road engineers said, we should resurface it. They put another layer of concrete across. No one actually thought to measure the capacity for the stanchions to maintain that extra weight, and it took the slightest nudge to bring the whole lot crashing down and killing 83 people. So it was cynical to say, oh, just change standards. Now we know those standards are critical. Or my family caught the train to and through Sydney the next day. Do you think that train crash has changed anything? Now that's what happens with our adverse events. We see them on the wall. We don't tell anyone. Oh, it happens all the time. Why worry about it? So they didn't wash their hands, so they had a urinary tract infection, so they had septicemia, and so they died. Happens all the time. That's the cynicism we have to avoid. Unless we say, I'm a statesperson. I need to tell people. And telling them in a hall like this is probably not going to work. But over a cup of coffee out the back near the steam train, just might. And maybe we should have a chat and encourage people from what we've learnt. So what Granville taught the rail industry was simply this. By the way, there's a bit of a pun here because the railway track is laid down on a bed of clay usually, and it's got to be kept quite level and needs to be dry. But the lessons here from Granville that adverse events can occur during any normal activity. So focusing only on M&Ms misses opportunities all the time. But if we talk to people on the ward, we talk to people in the lab, or from the lab to the ward, we talk to people about little things that we've learned, we can change it. Because only a few people actually see bad things coming. We can see them after they've happened, but only a few see them happening. And they can happen even when the rules are being obeyed. No one could find any breach in rules in the people involved in the Granville accident, except for the construction. Practice responses saved lives, and the best groups at Granville were the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. They practiced things the whole time. They knew what to do. And anyone that's been involved in a disaster, and I have in Cyclone Tracy, will know that those people were calm, coordinated. They came to you with a cup of coffee just when you needed it, or said, you should go and sit down, Doc, you need a rest. Okay? That's actually mentoring on the job, because cynicism otherwise remains the enemy. And in that situation, the mediocre mentor tells, the silly fools, they got it wrong. Everyone blamed the driver because he was going too fast. He wasn't. A good mentor explains, well, we now know that it was due to the fact there's a problem with the bridge structure. The superior mentor actually demonstrates what the problem was and how to prevent it from happening again. But the greatest mentors inspire people not to let it happen again. That's the challenge of mentoring. Roll on a few years to 1999, December 1999 at Glenbrook. On this occasion, the Indian Pacific was coming across from Perth, and the rear end of the train had the motor rail where the people put their cars. It came to a red signal in the mist early in the morning, and it stopped. And it tried to radio to the Central Railway control room, which it got through, and they said, it's a fault with the signals, proceed slowly. So it moved on. It came to a second red light. By now it's in a cutting and the communication didn't work. There's no one to talk to. How often have you seen staff in problems when they had no one to talk to? That's not being a good mentor, is it? It's not being a good friend, not being a good colleague. But that's what happened here. The electric train coming from Lithgow behind that train heard the first communication, didn't hear anything else, so thought, the Indian Pacific must have kept going. So it went through the red light, it came around and found the motor rail and ploughed into the back of it. 7 people died, 50 were injured. They blamed the faulty signals. No one really thought too much about the radio or telephone contact. Safe working rules were deliberately broken. Okay. How often have you seen persons, I'm seeing Robin smiling, this is a problem in any industry, deliberately break the rules because they think they know better? Okay. You've got to be absolutely 100% certain you know better than all the other evidence before you deliberately break rules. But you've got to tell people you're breaking them so they can check. There was no way the train driver could communicate with Central once he was in the cutting, and no one could check. They promised a safety audit in 1999. So what we can learn from this event is that we need to ensure that people recognise warning signs. Hey guys, we've put these policies in and we've got some rules here, and if the rules are broken, you've got to respond. New South Wales has actually led the world in the establishment of the Between the Flags program and the colour-coded charts. There are all sorts that are very similar around the world now. We keep coming in contact with them when we travel. They're warning signals, but we still see people deliberately not going on to follow the advice once a faulty sign is identified. Obviously, we had to ensure that communication was possible because no one actually knows better than the weight of evidence. Safety audits, which hadn't been done, could have warned of dangers ahead, but they weren't done. Disasters show negligence and point to dangers past, which means we failed to do safety audits. What we're doing as an institute here is we're providing a huge body of information to the system. But are people reading it? Are we talking to people about it and saying, this is relevant to what you do? This is not academia, this is learning in practice, which is one way you could define a mentor-mentee relationship. So what is mentoring? Well, is it coaching? Yeah, maybe. Is it success automatically? Definitely not, because we're telling people about mistakes. It provides motivation and advice. It provides an opportunity for training and support, but it also provides goals and direction for people. But when you put all that together, you actually start to get a machine that starts to work interactively. But what it really needs is for people to focus on the spindle of each of the gears around which their work rotates and understand the difference that each of us bring to the table. So we do bring something different to the table than the clinicians have. We do bring something different than the patients have. They bring something different that we don't have. So we need to make sure that we engage. And mentoring as a one-on-one communication exercise rapidly starts to become multiplied as people realise the value of those one-on-one relationships. Roll on now to January 2003. By the way, if you notice the dates here, what's common with all these dates? Sorry? January, December, school holiday times. And there were kids involved in all these accidents. But what also happens at holiday times? You just relax a little bit. Don't have to pay quite so much attention to the rules. This accident occurred actually because of medical illness. And in this accident, 7 people died. They were out of telephone range. Sorry? Didn't we have 2 accidents before? We talked about being out of communication. Why didn't they have an effective communication network? Now you can go just about all the way between here and Melbourne and not be out of telephone range at all. The driver actually had heart disease, hadn't been picked up before. That was one of the real causes. But the safety mechanisms to slow the train down once it started to accelerate didn't work. No one knows why the dead man's handle didn't work. And I mentioned my dad had been involved. He passed away before this event took place. But he would have been horrified because he knew that when he had observed a failure of the safety mechanisms in the country trains, it was because people did a cost-cutting exercise to put smaller copper pipe through which the air used to go. It was a pneumatically operated process. Cost-cutting saved money. Now, we don't think that happened here. But there certainly was an undeveloped safety culture because no audits had been done. Now the only thing that really changed significantly between Waterfall and Glenbrook, they'd started putting roads beside all the railway lines. There actually were tracks there for the maintenance guys to get to, but now they actually became access roads for emergency crews to get there. And wherever you go on the railways, now you'll always see a dirt track at least along the side of the track. Not quite as good as putting in data loggers, not quite as high tech, but at least it was a start. But what they were doing is relying on accident trends. Okay, we've had a few accidents in the last few years. It's not going to happen again. We've got time. We'll wait until we get a better and a cheaper data logger that we can use, and then we can drive change. Instead of thinking, we need to fix this before it happens again. Now, time is money. And everyone says, Cliff, you know, you're trying to say you want to have one-on-ones. It's too cumbersome. It's never going to work. You know, you've got to have 1 to 50, whatever it happens to be. Let's be efficient. But we actually don't realise that the one-to-one communication is where people listen, and when we see they listen, we can reinforce the learnings. Okay? And Ken Blanchard in this book here, it says, and it's quite, I mean, it takes you about 90 minutes to read the book. It's not that hard to read. Pick it up at the airport. Just a few minutes, and you start to impact on the way a person sees. And you start off by saying, that happened to me once, and I wished I had. And suddenly the hands come off the coffee. I've been so worried about it happening to me. How did you stop it happening? Well, we did 1, 2, 3. Oh, okay. Can you help me put those things in place in my particular workplace, wherever it happens to be? And just talking to some of you about your stresses about grant times. Talking to people, oh yeah, I had that pressure, what do you do about it? And it can be as simple as saying, well, let's have a look at time management. You spend more time worrying about it than you actually spend doing it. Okay. So it applies in the lab as it does in the wards. So what we need to do is to accumulate real-time data. Do you realise the volume of information you provide to the system to make it safe? You are frontline staff, and don't let anyone tell you different. Provided you actually go and talk to the other frontline staff and share your information with them. And Jeffrey and I have had long discussions about how can we actually see the faculty here providing a whole cohort of people that the department wants to employ to make sure we've got information at their disposal when they need it. Because we need to have safety measures in place now. Research is good, but it does look backwards very often. Communications, I've mentioned that before. Hazards need to be identified. In other words, we now check the safety of our train drivers. Pilots had their safety checks done for however, Robin, I can't think, an awful long time. How many passengers on a plane? Maybe 500 max on an A380. How many on a train? A few thousand every time. No one thought about it. Training is essential, and that's where we come to the one-on-one and resourcing. And I'm staying away from resourcing because that's the excuse we use for not doing anything. The last accident I want to tell you about occurred at Blackheath. This one wasn't in the public newspapers. 15th of March 1990. Blackheath is up on the Blue Mountains. The main Western Railway line, the one that the Indian Pacific goes along, came through this station. It was about 5 o'clock in the morning when I woke up, very nervous. And I said to Liz, my wife, there's something wrong with the track. She said, don't be silly, get back to sleep. It was Easter Saturday, by the way. I couldn't go back to sleep. I don't remember hearing anything during the night, but I woke up tense, and then I suddenly thought, the trains are making a different noise. Something has changed. So I got up, got dressed, and my brother-in-law was staying with me. And by the way, I am a train passionate fan. I always had a camera on the front veranda there to grab a steam train that might happen to be going through, or any other unusual train. So he grabbed my camera, and we walked up to the track, and this is what we saw. We saw that this thing here is called a fish plate. See these bolts? These bolts had held those two rails in line up until the night before, when the final one had broken. Probably this one here, because it's quite shiny, okay? And this fell off, this rail moved, and you can see how far out of a line it was there. You can see that a train has already hit it. That's the train that I subconsciously heard, okay? Something had changed. So, I went down to the station to tell the station master about the broken track. There was no one there. It was Easter Saturday. It was unmanned. There was no phone, no communication. So I went down to the police station. It was unmanned, but there was a phone through to Katoomba Police Station. So I rang through and got on to some constable. He was convinced that I was a nutter. Okay, I know he's right, but don't rub it out. So I said to Boyd, we've got to go back, drive down to Katoomba to the signal box and get them to fix this track. And that's what we did. Oh, well, that's what we wanted to do. As we were walking back, I saw a highway patrol car parked on the highway outside the fruit and veg shop. I went inside there was a guy there buying some bananas for his breakfast. And I said, excuse me, officer, there's a bit of a problem with the track. I need you to come and help. We've got a potential disaster. He swore at me, told me to, And I said, well, officer, look, I'm terribly sorry, but I've just noted your service number, and if there's a train derailment today, it'll be in the Sunday paper, so will your service number. So he came with me. That's pretty strong mentoring, isn't it? And he saw the track and he swore for the third time, and I said, look, just go down, there's a little brick building down there. Your emergency key will open that. There's a phone there, which I know goes to Katoomba. I can get the signalman, and they stop the trains, okay? About an hour later, this guy arrives, okay? He is the senior fettler, the senior guy in charge of the Great Western Railway line going across the Blue Mountains, and he's got gout, okay? Acute gout. He couldn't lift the spanner, and the spanners are big, by the way. I don't know if you can see this thing here. That's the spanner that they use to tighten up the bolts with. I said to him, oh, where's your gang? He said, it's Easter Saturday. They're all off playing soccer with their kids. I'm on my own. I said, it's all right, mate. I know a bit about trains. I'll help you. So he knocked the rest of the old bolts out, put the new bolts in, and believe it or not, that's the thin, gaunt me. I'm tightening up the bolts. Okay. He then went back down to ring and say the track's been repaired. He came back and he looked pale. I said, what's the matter? Do you know what the next train through was? It's the Indian Pacific. He said there would have derailed for sure with that broken rail. And I went home and I told my dad. He didn't have a very high opinion of academics. He said, probably save more lives today than the rest of your career put together. Possibly right. But what was it that made the difference? It's something my father told me when he used to go out and listen to locomotives that were being tested before they went into service around the state. And we'd stand on a knoll overlooking a hill where the trains were labouring uphill. He'd say, Cliff, listen to the rhythm. Listen to the rhythm. Listen to the rhythm. And that came back to me as a child, from a child to a kid asleep in 1990 in his bed, 5 a.m. in the morning. There's something wrong with the rhythm. So mentoring is a very powerful thing. And it'll pop up when you least expect it. So, what are the lessons from Blackheath? Broken guidelines are dangerous. Persistence is vital. And if we don't have somebody that we know we can go to, we'll probably give up. Now, this is the difference between the lecturer, the professor, the boss, the charge nurse, and the mentor, who we can chat things about. Can you see that there's a whole layer of extra communication and extra safety built in if we've got mentors and mentees? Because, in fact, anybody can help. Even a surgeon can tighten up a nut. Okay? I don't mean other surgeons, I mean a nut. But we need incentives. We need to encourage people to talk to each other because near misses provide invaluable lessons. What was the lesson here? I was asked to write a report by the fettler because I'd heard the track noise, which I did. I sent it off, heard nothing more. When my dad died 8 years later, going through his papers, I actually found a copy of the letter because my mother, who'd been a legal secretary, had typed for me with a copy of those photographs. They're all out of the originals from that letter. And I thought, it's a shame that no one had thought to write back. I'm sure Dad would have been really proud that his son had done something on the railways. So I wrote a letter to the new commissioner, who wrote back within 3 days, said, interesting story, thank you for it. I haven't got the file, but I'm going to find it. I think you did a good job. Within 3 weeks, I got the original photographs back, the original letter, and he said, I looked at this, you obviously did do something good that day. He said, can I put it into the staff magazine to teach my staff? 8 years it took for that message to get out to the staff. Okay. And we need to understand that we have to push and push and push if we're going to drive change. Because we learnt the lessons from a near miss. No one died. So what is mentoring in the realm of the patient safety and clinical quality program? It's all of these things here. It's informal. It's casual. It looks like fun. It looks like it interacts across a whole range of areas. That's the difference between mentoring and formal teaching, training, authority. So what is a mentor? A mentor is someone who sees more talent and ability within you than you see in yourself and helps you bring it out. Bob Proctor said that. Don't you want to find someone who thinks more of you than you think of yourself? Well, why don't you think about the people that you work with? Because they probably want to find someone else. And you can see the good things in them. And a word of encouragement at the right time makes such a world of difference. Or a body of information from a laboratory, and I don't mean a laboratory in the sense of chemicals, I mean a research laboratory of any sort. And what they do at the Coalface makes a ton of difference to the way they go about their job. And it starts with the same sorts of things we've been talking about on the railways. Openness about failures, emphasis on learning, obligation to act, being accountable. I held myself accountable for Blackheath because I knew. Now, nobody else knew I knew. I could have got away with it. I would not have slept well that night, I can assure you. There's a just culture. We don't blame people. We actually support people through the learning process, so that they can in future appropriately prioritise the actions necessary to make information and teamwork work. So what is the key to all of this? Obviously it's you and me, but a few tips. This comes from the Cognito group. Tricia Holman has put these out, and again you can look this up on the website. The 5 tips, she says. Be a role model. Okay? People will do what you do rather than what you say. Be empathetic. Understand where they come from. And that's more and more important in cross-cultural, multidisciplinary teams than ever before. Help in evolving strengths and diluting weaknesses. Okay? So if you see a strength, build on it. If you see a weakness, try and dilute it. Put protectives. Listen effectively. Be open-minded. But then she goes and says, but there's 5 more. We'll stop at 10. Have great patience. Display commitment. Make sure you ring your mentor. I've got a mentee in London at the moment. He's got nothing to do with medicine whatsoever. He's in real estate. But we communicate once a month. I sent him about a 5-minute email on my phone the other day. I got a 3-page summary of all the things going on in his mind straight away. He just wanted someone to listen. Educate and pass on what you learn from the laboratory of life to the laboratory of adverse events. But also remember that people are private and individuals, and there's some things they don't want to talk about. Okay? Dragging people out the front to tell about their bad night stories never works, because it immediately introduces a sense of shame. We've all been there, we've all done that. But if we get alongside someone and say, I noticed you were struggling in the ward round, is there something you need to tell me? You need to tell somebody else? I don't need to know if you've got somebody else. You'll be surprised how often they'll ring up for a cup of coffee that day. And tailor advice to the circumstances. Then you become an effective mentor. And you allow people to go out ahead of the team and be trailblazers. Because trailblazers, by definition, is lonely work. But you also need to come back for refreshment. And what I like, and I've talked in this audience before about this book, The Great Good Place. We learn so much by talking to each other around food and drink. And when we do that, we can start to identify the problem, but then we can also talk about how we might solve the puzzle. So the puzzle, as we finish, and this is the last tiny little bit, is for you to go away and get into your huddles, wherever they happen to be, and work out which part of a train is always going backwards. All right, I'm not going to give you the answer. You can ring me up and ask me or email me, and I'll tell you where to find the answer. But there is one part of a train that is always going backwards relative to the Earth. Okay? And it's crucially important because, in a sense, research is always going backwards, in a sense, to progress, because we're looking at what we've learnt from the past, isn't it? So that's the puzzle. I suggest to you, you'll best solve that, not by going to your learned teachers, although they've got all the answers, but by going to a mate, a friend, a colleague, and saying, I need someone that I can talk to from time to time. Are you interested? Or, I know you're struggling, I'm happy to help you, I've been there, done that, happy to talk, and see what happens. Because if we just sit still, okay, even the humorists like Will Rogers understand if we just sit still and do nothing, we can be on the right track, we'll still get run over by a steam train. Thanks very much. I think it'll depend on the context of where the people work and play. But I think what you'll see will be many more conversations which look a lot deeper around morning tea and afternoon tea. There'll be people that'll be hiving off and having a cup of coffee or going and having a beer together, talking about life in general, just as we do in our families.
So do we train the staff to do that?
I think we do have to. I think we train them to do M&Ms, which is not really a just culture. We think it is, but it's not. We train people to do other sorts of stuff. We don't actually train them to share their experiences for the benefit of the other person. I have a problem with some of the literature at the moment, and it's a formal process, and it almost sounds like the boss and his staff. I think the one person you don't go to be a mentor is your boss, unless there's something outstanding about them. But you go to somebody else who's in leadership, yes, that's okay. But if it becomes another line of command, I don't think it's going to work. And that's, I'm starting to see that come out in the literature. And of course, that came out of the armed services. That was pretty common as well there.
So can we again thank Clifford for fantastic.